Medieval peasants, people we casually imagine as ignorant, dirty, and barely surviving, quietly practiced a form of food science so advanced that modern nutrition still struggles to replicate it. And the proof is sitting right on your kitchen counter if you know where to look, because sourdough bread was never just bread to them. It was survival encoded into fermentation, a living system refined. Over centuries of trial, hunger, and death, a system that protected their guts, strengthened their immune systems, preserved grain without refrigeration, and extracted nutrition from wheat that modern industrial bread has almost completely destroyed. And here's the uncomfortable truth we've forgotten. Peasants didn't choose sourdough because it tasted good or because it was trendy or artisanal. You chose it because anything else slowly killed you, because untreated grain wrecks digestion, inflames the gut, steals minerals from the body, and weakens you over time. And medieval people, without microscopes, without biochemistry, without influencers, figured out that if you let flour and water sit, something invisible but powerful wakes up. Wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria that pre-digest tea, grain, neutralize phytic acid, unlock minerals like iron and zinc, and create acids that protect the bread from mold while protecting the eater from disease. And they learned this not from textbooks, but from watching who lived and who didn't. Because in a world where a bad harvest meant death, food was never casual, never just calories. It was medicine or poison, and sourdough was the dessert. NCE, which is why nearly every medieval culture across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia independently developed long-fermented bread traditions, not because they were copying each other, but because fermentation was the only technology that consistently worked. And when we say peasants knew a secret, the secret wasn't mystical, it was biological. And what makes it tragic is that we didn't forget it because it stopped working. We forgot it because speed and profit replaced patience and survival. Because once roller mills arrived in the 19th century and stripped grain of its germ and bran for shelf life, once commercial yeast was isolated to make bread rise in hours instead of days, once bread became a factory product instead of a living process, we severed the relationship between time and nourishment, and we told ourselves the new bread was progress, even as digestive disorders, gluten sensitivity, mineral deficiencies, and metabolic disease quietly exploded. And here's where the story becomes uncomfortable for modern ears. Medieval peasants ate bread constantly, often more than half their daily calories, and yet historical records show far lower rates of the gut disorders we normalize today because their bread was already partially digested before it ever entered their bodies, because sourdough fermentation breaks gluten down into simpler proteins, reduces inflammatory compounds, and feeds beneficial gut bacteria instead of starving them. And this is not nostalgia or romanticism. This is chemistry and microbiology confirming what tradition already knew, because lactic acid fermentation lowers the glycemic response of bread, meaning medieval bread spiked blood sugar far less aggressively than modern white bread does, keeping energy stable rather than addictive, steady rather than crashing. And imagine the implication of that in a world of physical labor, peasants plowing fields, harvesting grain, carrying stone, fueled not by sugar highs but by slow, stable energy from fermented bread, while we sit at desks eating enriched loaves that leave us bloated, foggy, and hungry again in 2 hours. And the irony deepens when you realize medieval people didn't even have words for probiotics or gut microbiomes, yet their daily bread actively cultivated one. Because sourdough is not just fermented flour, it's a delivery system for beneficial bacteria that interact with the human digestive system in ways we are only now mapping. And this is where the modern myth collapses, the idea that progress is linear, that newer automatically means better. Because in the case of bread, progress amputated wisdom. It removed the slow processes that made grains safe and nourishing and replaced them with shortcuts that our bodies were never designed to handle. And when people today say bread doesn't agree with me, what they're really saying is industrial bread doesn't agree with a human digestive system evolved alongside fermented food. Because for most of human history, almost nothing was eaten unfermented. Milk became yogurt or cheese. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Grains became sourdough, and fermentation was humanity's original digestive assistant, outsourced to microbes before eating, and peasants understood this intuitively. Time was an ingredient, patience was protection, and hunger taught faster than any laboratory. So when we laugh at medieval peasants while popping antacids and probiotics and gluten-free substitutes, we're missing the uncomfortable reversal that they solved problems we are now paying industries to manage, and the most disturbing part is that the secret was never hidden. It was simply slow, and slowness is the one thing modern systems cannot afford, which is why sourdough vanished from daily life and reappeared centuries later as a luxury, rebranded as artisan food for people who can afford time, even though it was once the bread of the poor, the bread of survival, the bread that quietly carried microbial intelligence across generations. And this raises a dangerous question modern society hates to ask: what else did we abandon? Not because it failed, but because it refused to hurry to understand why medieval sourdough worked so well, while modern bread quietly fails us. You have to stop thinking about bread as a solid object and start thinking about it as a biological process. Because the real difference isn't flour or wheat or even gluten itself, it's what happens to those components over time. And medieval peasants, without knowing the words, were running a slow biochemical transformation that fundamentally changed how grain interacted with the human body. Because when flour and water ferment for 24, 48, sometimes 72 hours, lactic acid bacteria begin dismantling phytic acid, compound in grains that binds minerals and prevents your body from absorbing iron, magnesium, calcium, and zinc, meaning modern fast bread doesn't just fail to nourish you, it actively steals nutrition unless you supplement it back artificially, while sourdough unlocks what was already there. And this alone explains why populations living almost entirely on bread didn't collapse into deficiency the way modern diets do. But the process goes further, because gluten, so often blamed today, is not a single substance, but a family of proteins, and long fermentation breaks these proteins into simpler, less inflammatory fragments, effectively pre-digesting the bread before you ever chew it, which is why many people who believe they are gluten intolerant discover they can eat real sourdough without pain, bloating, or brain fog, not because their bodies magically changed, but because the bread did. And medieval peasants knew this through lived experience, not ideology. Because if bread made you sick, you didn't eat it again, you didn't debate it on social media, you adjusted the process until it stopped harming you, and over generations those adjustments became tradition, ritual, and habit, passed down not as recipes but as rules of survival. And this is where modern bread production reveals its fatal flaw. Because industrial yeast was selected not for digestion, nutrition, or health, but for speed and predictability, it inflates dough rapidly, traps gas quickly, and produces a loaf in hours rather than days. But it does almost nothing to neutralize phytic acid or break down complex proteins, so the bread looks finished long before it is biologically ready, and we eat it anyway. And then we wonder why our guts revolt, why blood sugar spikes violently, why hunger returns immediately, why bread feels addictive rather than sustaining. Because sourdough fermentation lowers the glycemic index of bread dramatically, slowing carbohydrate absorption and stabilizing energy, while modern bread behaves more like sugar than food, creating crashes that medieval laborers simply could not afford. Because a crashing peasant didn't just feel tired, he starved or died. And here's where the gluten myth truly collapses, because wheat itself has been selectively bred over the last century to maximize yield and baking performance, increasing gluten strength and density far beyond what medieval varieties contained, meaning modern bread combines hyper-glutenized grain with zero fermentation, the worst possible pairing for the human digestive system. And we blame the wheat, the gut, the person, anything except the process we abandoned. And the tragedy deepens when you realize fermentation doesn't just make bread digestible, it makes it safe. Cause lactic acid bacteria create an acidic environment that suppresses harmful pathogens, extending shelf life naturally and protecting entire households from foodborne illness long before refrigeration existed. Which is why sourdough cultures were guarded like family heirlooms, because killing your starter meant risking sickness, hunger, or death. And compare that to modern kitchens where bread molds in days and preservatives replace microbial balance. And we call this advancement, even though medieval peasants intuitively understood that the microbes working with them were allies, not enemies, that invisible life could be cultivated rather than sterilized. And this worldview is what we truly lost, because modern food systems are built on control and acceleration, not cooperation and company. Operation takes time. and time is incompatible with quarterly profits. And so bread was stripped of fermentation, then stripped of nutrients, then enriched, synthetically, then marketed back to us as convenience, while our bodies quietly pay the cost. And this is why sourdough's return today feels revolutionary when it should feel normal, because it exposes a lie we've been told since childhood, that efficiency equals progress, when in reality biological systems punish haste, and medieval peasants didn't romanticize slowness, they respected it, because slowness kept them alive. And when you realize that, sourdough stops being a food trend and starts looking like a warning from the past, a reminder that humans evolved eating food transformed by microbes, time and patience, not factories, and that when we remove those elements, we don't just change flavor, we change how food interacts with blood, hormones, immunity, and even behavior, because hunger driven by blood sugar crashes is not hunger, it's manipulation. And medieval bread fed people, modern bread stimulates them, and those are not the same thing at all. Sourdough did not disappear because it stopped working or because people suddenly discovered something better. It vanished because it was incompatible with the logic of industrial power, because a food that requires days of fermentation, attention, and microbial cooperation cannot be easily centralized, standardized, or scaled without losing what makes it valuable. And this is the part of the story that makes modern audiences uncomfortable. Because once bread stopped being made in homes and villages and moved into factories, control replaced tradition, speed replaced patience, and profit replaced nourishment and commercia. Yeast wasn't an innocent invention, it was a strategic one, because it allowed bread to be produced anywhere, anytime, without reliance on living cultures that demanded care and continuity, severing people from the microbial relationships their ancestors had maintained for thousands of years. And in doing so, bread became predictable, uniform, and empty, which is perfect for logistics but disaster. US for biology. And this shift aligned perfectly with the rise of wage labor and urbanization, because workers fueled by fast-digesting bread experience sharper hunger cycles, more frequent crashes, and greater dependency on regular consumption, which keeps them buying, eating, and working in tighter loops, unlike fermented bread, which sustains longer and demands less. And while medieval peasants were dependent on bread, they were not dependent on constant replenishment, because their food was designed to last in the body, not just on the shelf. And this is where the idea of enrichment reveals its absurdity, because once natural nutrition was stripped away for shelf life and appearance, synthetic vitamins had to be added back to prevent public health collapse, turning bread into a nutritional simulation rather than a living food. And we accepted this because we were taught to associate softness, whiteness, and speed with progress, even though those qualities would have alarmed our ancestors, who judged bread by how long it sustained them, not how quickly it rose. And yet the old knowledge never fully died. It survived in monasteries, rural villages, and forgotten kitchens, passed quietly between generations as habit rather than ideology, until modern science finally caught up and confirmed what tradition already knew, that fermentation improves digestion, mineral absorption, immune function, and metabolic stability. And this is the cruel irony, because we abandoned sourdough in the name of science before science could explain it, and now we are rediscovering it as if it were new, packaging it as luxury, charging premiums for what was once the food of survival, while digestive disorders skyrocket among populations eating the most advanced bread in history. And the forgotten secret, then, is not really about sourdough at all. It's about the cost of divorcing food from time. Because medieval peasants lived inside natural rhythms, seasons, fermentation, rest, decay, and their food reflected that, while modern systems fight those rhythms at every step, sterilizing, accelerating, and optimizing until the body becomes the weak link, blamed for failing to tolerate what it was never meant to consume. And when you realize this, sourdough stops being a nostalgic return to the past and becomes a quiet act of resistance, a refusal to accept that faster is better or cheap. At convenience is harmless, because making real sourdough forces you to slow down, to care for something living, to plan ahead, and to accept that good things cannot be rushed without consequence. And this is why the secret feels so dangerous now, because it challenges the core assumption of modern life, that efficiency is neutral, when in reality, efficiency reshapes bodies, behaviors, and depende. NCIEs and medieval peasants, dismissed as backward, understood something we are relearning the hard way. Food is not just fuel, it is a relationship. And when you break that relationship in the name of speed, the body remembers even if the culture forgets, which is why sourdough still works when so much else doesn't, because it was never designed for profit or scale or convenience. It was design. To keep humans alive in a world that offered no second chances. And the question we're left with is not whether medieval peasants knew a secret, but whether we are willing to slow down enough to admit they were right.